Thank you so much for bringing me here to the conference organizers from Western Michigan University. It's great to come across the lake to Michigan, being from Wisconsin. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'm an associate professor there in the urban planning department, and I'll be talking about the city of Milwaukee's pedestrian master plan and some of the innovative approaches that we use to collect data through that planning process. The planning process started last summer and is just concluding now, so I'll give you a sneak preview at some of the initial general recommendations that will be coming from that plan. I do want to emphasize, to follow up on our keynote speaker and the excellent introduction to this topic, is that walkability is central to livable communities. And so Milwaukee's realized that, and it has enacted its first ever pedestrian master plan. The partnership that's being used to develop that plan involves the City of Milwaukee's Department of Public Works, National Expert Consultant Tool Design Group, and then folks from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, some of my students and myself, who are adding some research expertise to this team. So I'll put in a plug here for bringing on an academic perspective into some of your planning efforts. This is a great mix of practitioners and academics, and so it's great to move that sort of partnership forward to help move plans to the next level. The Milwaukee plan's purpose is to make Milwaukee more pedestrian friendly for people of all ages and abilities. In doing that, we wanted to really shed some light and provide a picture of what it's like to experience walking in Milwaukee. And so the research that we did focused on trying to identify the experience and what were the barriers to people walking. And I'm going to focus on three different types of research that we use to contribute to the plan: pedestrian crash rate analysis, driver yielding observations, and a broad public survey. And I'm going to touch on a few of the strategies to overcome barriers that were identified through that planning process. The first aspect of the analysis that we did was looking at crash rates. And we can often look at just the raw number of crashes that are reported to police, and that gives us some sense of where incidents are occurring, but it doesn't really indicate the risk of crossing the street at any particular location. So we need an estimate of exposure to give us a sense of the true risk for each individual every time they cross the street. The crash data that we used were police reported crashes from our Wisconsin database. And then we estimated exposure using pedestrian counts taken at short periods at multiple locations throughout the city, and then expanded those counts out to annual time periods, and then used a model to estimate the volumes at more than 4,000 intersections across the city. So first, to give you a sense of what the distribution of pedestrian crashes looks like, is this map up here. We looked at crashes that were reported within 80 feet of the center of an intersection. There are 4,470 main roadway intersections, that's arterial and collector roadways in Milwaukee. Between 2012 and 2016, there were 1,540 pedestrian crashes near these intersections. One intersection had 14 crashes. 924 of the intersections experienced at least one crash. The spatial distribution is shown on the map. But it's important, of course, to have the context of the exposure. And so we collected data at 66 intersections throughout the city. 2-hour counts we put together. Some of them were collected previously by the city, and so we added to the existing database, and then developed a model that would help predict what the volumes were at all the other locations where we hadn't done actual counts. Without getting into too much detail of this model, there have been similar types of efforts done in San Francisco, in Montreal, Charlotte, North Carolina, Minneapolis. These types of models take the land use characteristics surrounding an intersection and the transportation system characteristics and figure out which ones are most associated with pedestrian counts. And so we were then able to use that statistical association to identify an equation that we could use to apply and estimate volumes for an entire year at each of these intersections. Being close to a commercial property, a park, a university campus, and then having higher population density and job density were the factors that were in our model. The model predicts relatively well, but still there are many improvements that can be made. Sorry that my plot is not showing up there in this graph, but trust me, is some accuracy to it. When we applied the model to the city as a whole, these 4,470 intersections, if we counted up all the times pedestrians cross these throughout the entire year, we get 900 million pedestrian crossings. So the average intersection has about 551 pedestrian crossings per day. You can see there's certain parts of the city where there's higher concentrations, close to downtown, close to Marquette University and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. There's also some commercial corridors that have relatively high pedestrian volumes, though the locations that are more lower density residential areas that are dispersed, these have lower pedestrian volumes. What's important about this for understanding safety is that we can use it for our denominator and estimating what the crash risk is. So if you remember, I showed you the picture of the number of crashes at each intersection throughout Milwaukee, and you can see the larger dots representing more crashes. Once we estimate the exposure and then convert this to a risk measure and controlling for the number of crossings there are, we get a different picture of risk. So you can see flipping back and forth between these, the numbers of crashes tend to be concentrating to the downtown area in particular and close to some of these major pedestrian activity zones. But once we look at where the highest risks are, we start to see some corridors that, if you know Milwaukee, these are high volume, higher speed roadways. And so we have a high risk when we need to cross those. This is one part of the picture that we were painting through collecting these data. So these are some of the high pedestrian crash rate corridors that need special attention in the pedestrian plan. They have higher speed limits and tend to have wider roadways with more lanes. In addition, we took a look at some of the speed data that the city had collected through 48-hour tube counts. And the numbers are actually pretty surprising. We had certain corridors where 15% of the vehicles exceeded the speed limit by 10 miles an hour or more. There were even some special corridors, South 35th Street, West Capitol Drive, where we had 1 in 15 to 1 in 20 cars that were traveling 20 miles an hour or higher above the posted 30 mile an hour speed limit. So this is an unfriendly pedestrian environment. Almost 1,000 vehicles per day on one of these streets going 50 in a 30. If we look at the physical characteristics of these locations, once we know the risk at them, the one on the, on this left side of the screen, 23.3 crashes per million crossings versus 1.9 crashes per million crossings. Both these locations had 4 reported crashes over a 5-year period. One with more than 10 times the risk has a much wider intersection, multi-lane, many turning lanes, versus the one that's just one, 2-lane street in each direction. Similar example comparing these two roadways. Almost 10 times higher risk at this intersection versus that one. So understanding the risk, once we account for exposure, is critical to understanding these roadway features and how they relate to the comfort of the walking environment, comfort and safety. Next, we looked at some yielding observations. How do drivers actually behave when they approach a crosswalk that is uncontrolled? So in this example here, this is a crosswalk, the pedestrian stepping into the roadway. There's no traffic signal or stop sign for that vehicle. However, the law says a driver must yield the right of way when a pedestrian sets foot into that crosswalk. We know that this is a high-risk situation. 28% of fatal pedestrian crashes in Wisconsin involved drivers not yielding to pedestrians. But it's also important to think about these situations in terms of the corridor. There are many pedestrian crashes that are occurring at non-crosswalk locations, mid-block, that if drivers were anticipating the potential for a pedestrian to be in the roadway, it may be a kid chasing after a ball or somebody who's been drinking too much. If somebody is driving with the anticipation that they might need to yield in this situation, My bet is that they're going to be more likely to stop for those pedestrians in other cases, where we have 3/4 of fatal pedestrian crashes involving drivers traveling straight. So we collected the data around Milwaukee at 40 different locations, 40 intersections that were all along 2-lane major roadways. These are locations with either 25 or 30-mile-an-hour speed limits. They are arterial and collector roadways. Of 1,000, there were 825 yielding opportunities, and 21% of the drivers yielded in this case. If we take a weighted average, it was actually 17%. So about 1 in 5 drivers were yielding. This is really important information to know, that we had people maybe not even aware that the law says that they need to yield, not even having that expectation. Of course, it's not just simply behavior. There's also a lot that has to do with the roadway design and the surrounding neighborhood environment. So we looked at the difference between some locations that had higher yielding rates. So the green here shows a higher yielding versus red, where nobody yielded in that case over 2 hours. The locations with higher yielding had certain characteristics. They tended to have slower speed limits, lower traffic volumes, shorter crossing distances, and a bus stop was present. The bus stop may be a proxy for pedestrian activity and general drivers needing to be aware that people were being dropped off or going to the bus stop. Pedestrian characteristics were also important. Pedestrians who were clearly indicating their intent to cross were more likely to be yielded to. So if they were leaning towards the other side of the roadway or looking directly at the driver for more than 3 seconds, they had a greater chance of being yielded to. The last thing we found through this driver yielding was that the locations that had fewer reported pedestrian crashes actually had higher driver yielding rates. This is one of the first studies that we have that's really making that direct connection between increased yielding and a higher level of pedestrian safety in terms of reduced crashes. We also did public survey to gather people's experience and thoughts about the walking in the roadway environment. Overall, most of the people who responded to our survey responded online. There were 1,700 plus total responses. But we also had some door-to-door surveys that were distributed. And I want to give you a sense of what those are in just a second. But the big theme that we got from talking to people and getting their survey responses reinforced what we were finding through data collection in the field. Bad driver behavior, higher traffic speeds, people being concerned about lack of traffic enforcement, and crime and personal security. These were actually preventing people from walking more, in particular elderly residents. We were hearing that these are barriers to getting around the city or getting around even in their own neighborhoods. So some of the comments you see up here, it's a great walking city, but drivers don't respect crosswalks. We want to slow traffic on our arterials. Reckless driving is an issue. We want to see tickets being given to drivers who don't yield. These reinforce what we saw through quantitative analysis. The door-to-door survey distribution, I think, is an important thing to be considering if you're doing a local planning effort. Not everybody gets involved in responding to a survey online. It just doesn't necessarily get to each person who may be interested. So we went door-to-door to all the different city council members' districts, 2 blocks in each of those, and randomly distributed to those. So 161 surveys came back. And I'll just say, it's fairly easy to get a lot of the people who are living on the east side of Milwaukee. It tends to be a wealthier community, more involved, engaged in local politics. Getting them to respond online was easy. By doing the door-to-door survey, we got responses in all these neighborhoods further west in the city. And so this was a good way to increase public participation. And in doing so, we did happen to find that across all neighborhoods in Milwaukee, people were saying, it's great that we have bus stops and sidewalks and we have pretty good curb ramps and a lot of places to walk to, but these driver behavior and big busy streets are a big barrier that we're all facing. So having that door-to-door survey gave us a good sense that throughout the city, people were feeling these same barriers. So overall, through these different methods of data collection, we painted a picture. So we were getting information about exposure, gathering high risk corridor information, figuring out how people actually yielded or not, and then got more information from door-to-door surveys. In doing so, we've told a story about pedestrian barriers. There's difficult crossings, bad driver behavior, wider roadways, and that's deterring people from experiencing their own communities. We have places like this roadway, somebody trying to cross at an intersection here, but doesn't have a crosswalk, and it's a major thoroughfare. Cars aren't even thinking about them. We have other locations that are multi-lane roadways that really have been prioritized for automobile traffic, even though people do walk in these places. So a few of the strategies that the city, in draft form currently, I need to give that caveat, is working on to overcome these barriers are engineering, education, and enforcement. The E's are critical to making steps forward, and the city embraces these. It's currently in the process of adopting a complete streets policy. So no longer is the city going to prioritize automobile level of service as the only criterion for doing roadway projects and making roadway improvements in the city. We're thinking about providing bicycle infrastructure, better pedestrian crossings, sidewalk and curb ramp improvements, all as a part of roadway projects. The draft plan is going to be including some conceptual diagrams of what could be done in the short term and the long term. At an intersection like this, simply improving the markings of crosswalks and adding no turn on red at particular locations where it's warranted makes sense. In the longer term, doing changes that could improve the geometry of the intersection, curb extensions and bus bulb outs, narrowing the pedestrian crossing distances, all sorts of things that can make walking better in Milwaukee. Road diets are another type of project that are being considered. Reconfiguring the lanes from 2 lanes in each direction to 1 in each direction and providing bike lanes and a refuge for people to cross halfway is a strategy the city's done in some places and will be likely moving forward even more with through this pedestrian plan. Using signs, the in-roadway pedestrian crossing signs, as well as considering the gateway treatment, which is something that's been researched here at Western Michigan University, Ron Van Houten, through studies by the Michigan DOT. This is something now that we in Milwaukee are looking at too, very seriously. Of course, improving roadway lighting. Many of these crashes are occurring at nighttime, and so having better visibility at crosswalks and key locations for pedestrians is critical. On the enforcement side, we are doing some pilot high visibility enforcement program applications starting last summer, but continuing on to this summer. One of the best examples of a high visibility enforcement effort was in Gainesville, Florida, and Ron Van Houten also studied this, showing increases of driver yielding from 30% all the way up till 70% over a year-long period where the city of Gainesville had education, media outreach, and enforcement all working together to change the culture of yielding. What's great about this study even is that even though the level of effort that went into the media outreach did not continue 3 years later, the culture had still changed, and driver yielding even increased more in the 4 years following this study. And during that same period, crash rates also went down for pedestrians. So there's a lot of promise for high visibility enforcement. In Milwaukee, we're also really pushing increasing walking and biking. Not just because it's good for physical activity, it also makes the entire community safer. When you have a better mix of users on roadways, drivers are more aware. Pedestrians and bicyclists reinforce good behavior. And so it makes streets safer for everyone. And Milwaukee has a tradition of neighborhood-oriented walking events, closing down streets to bring community together, street festivals, and so we can build on those sorts of efforts to ultimately become a better community for pedestrians. So with that, welcome any questions that you have about our efforts in Milwaukee.